Hei og velkommen til denne episoden av Unge Entreprenører. I dag så har vi med oss dr. Matthew Lynch, som førsteamanuensis ved Høgskolen i Østfold og NMBU, og underviser i entreprenørskap og kreativitet. I dag så skal vi ta en samtale om hans erfaringer med hvordan det å tilrettelegge og fasilitere for ungt entreprenørskap, og også se litt på hva det som ligger bak tankesettet til en entreprenør. Did I make you, did I do you justice in that one?
Sure. I mean, it sounds good. It all sounds pretty accurate. There was no lies in there so far. So far. We'll wait till later to get into the lies and conspiracy theories, but
fake news.
For now it seems accurate.
Okay, sounds good. So let's just kick it off with the entrepreneurial mindset. You wrote your doctoral thesis on that.
That's correct.
So just like from the beginning, what does it mean, the entrepreneurial mindset?
It's a big question. After writing a doctorate, I can confirm I still have no idea what it really means. I just end up with more questions, which maybe it says I did something right with regards to research. I always think, the more you dig into things, the more questions you end up getting. But to try and start answering both your question and my own, I would say I started from this perspective of noticing it seemed pretty obvious to me that there was a difference in attitude or the way people were thinking for those who are successful and managed to start a business and get things done versus those who basically didn't. And so I end up framing my research question or my key research question around what's the difference between those who do actually manage to start a business versus those who want to, say, have the motivation to do it, but just talk about it and never actually get it done. What's the sort of cognitive difference, or what's the difference in their head and the way they're thinking? And I guess, like all naive researchers, I was kind of hoping to find a really concrete, clear answer that maybe I could find this answer and then I'd be done with that question. But I would say after looking at it for quite a while, I just have ended up with a lot of different perspectives and a lot of different questions around it. I could maybe jump into talking a little bit about my current view of how I see mindsets. I'd, of course, put a caveat on that, which is this is my current understanding. I hope it changes and develops over time, and that, we can look back on this in sort of a year or two and say, oh, it's awkward, it's now completely out of date, and I see things differently, because, that just shows that you'll be learning along the way.
Yeah.
But basically the way I see it now is that the word mindset describes itself in the sense that your mind gets set on generating an outcome.
What was your initial insight going in before you started researching?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really have a good definition before I went in, and that's part of what spurred me on, because I was looking at existing literature, particularly in the academic field, and found it very unsatisfactory with regards to an answer. And so, yeah, my current perspective, as I was saying, was like that your mind gets set on an outcome, right? And you say, okay, well, what's important about that? And the reason it's important is because it's focused on trying to get something done. And like most of us, we try some tactics or we try some things, and it sometimes works and we get the outcome we want. Great, we're done. We've got a business that's working. But often what happens for most of us is we try some things and they don't work. And the reason that entrepreneurial mindset plays a crucial role is because then the entrepreneur says, well, okay, my first attempt didn't work. I'll try something new. I'll try a new tactic. I'll try a new approach to things. I'll try a new way of trying to get things done. And in that sense, you're willing to be what I would call ambiguous about tactics, in the sense that you're just like, the tactics don't matter as long as I get the outcome I want. A little bit before we started this, we were talking about the difference between routines and addiction and mindset. Maybe we could jump into that if you'd like.
Yeah,
sure. Just a question about the term mindset. Is it more outcome oriented than, let's say, like a perspective or a paradigm? Because that would be more like a worldview, but like how I understand you now, the mindset is set on an outcome or objective or goal.
Great question. The answer is yes to both. In the way that I just described it was one description, and I guess it's a very like narrow perspective. The other way to think about it, mindset, is you could think about it as like putting on a pair of glasses, and that pair of glasses, say, blocks out some things. It allows some things to come through normally as they were. It may in some ways create the appearance of things that weren't really there before. And then it also could say strengthen certain things. And so if we use a certain example, or a more concrete example of what I mean by that, if we look at opportunities, you might say that an entrepreneurial mindset connects closely to, do you see the opportunity? Do you not see an opportunity? Do you see an opportunity that doesn't really exist? Or do you see the objective reality out there of how things are? And in that way, your mindset sort of filters out the way you see the world and changes the way you view things. And the way to think about that as well is that there's a difference between mindset and mindsets. And so if we think about mindsets in the plural, we could think about the fact that mindsets often occur over different stages. So the first stage might be noticing or setting a kind of goal or a desire, or what is it that's desirable or that you want as an outcome. And then from there you might select some methods about how to try and do that. And then once you've elaborated or come up with different methods that you select one of those methods, and then you implement the method as the next step. And then you have to be honest with yourself about, did it work or did it not work? If it did work, great, we got the outcome we wanted. But that really happens with the first time. Often we have to say, no, it didn't work. So then I go back to my list of options about tactics or strategies I could use, and I can pick a new tactic and try and implement that and see if it works. And if it does work, great. If not, then I have to go back to the drawing board. There's also another option in there, which is that I say, hey, actually, after trying this several times or trying it once, I've found out that my goal or the outcome I wanted no longer is as desirable to me as it was originally, or maybe I've changed my perspective on things. And in that sense, you can update your goals or what you're driving towards.
How does one get to that point where you allow yourself to go back to the drawing board?
Yeah, it's a good question. And a big question, how do you get to the point where you realize it isn't working?
Is it something you're born with, or is it something you can learn over time?
I mean, if I reframe your question to, are you born with an entrepreneurial mindset or do you develop it over time? Then in some ways that was an earlier debate, and I think it's been somewhat settled, which is it's a bit of both. Like, of course, you can be born with, I would call it traits or features that predispose you to be an entrepreneur or increase your chances of being an entrepreneur.
What are those traits?
I'll just answer the second part and then I'll get back to it, which would be, and then the other part is like, of course, you can learn to be an entrepreneur. And I strongly believe that anyone can learn to be an entrepreneur. But it means some people will, of course, have a more difficult path towards being an entrepreneur. And I think that's true of many skills, really. Some people will be born with a predisposition for a certain skill or a certain sport, but most of us can get up to a pretty high level through practice and training and coaching and learning and going through those normal steps that all of us will be familiar with from other things. What traits predispose you to being an entrepreneur? That's more of a contentious question. I don't mind going there, but I want to put the caveat on it beforehand, which is these are other people's research, and so I haven't done any research on it myself. I'm simply would be parroting other people's research. There's, for example, one really contentious piece of research that I think could easily be misunderstood, and we can get into that one, which is basically saying that. And this comes actually, interestingly enough, from outside the field of entrepreneurship in general, but it was looking at entrepreneurship and saying that if you have higher levels of testosterone, you're more likely to take risks. And this particular research made the argument that, therefore, people with higher levels of testosterone are more likely to take risks, and who has more testosterone? Men
Men.
predominantly. And what they were saying is one of the differences between, say, that there's socially healthy ways to take risk and there's socially unhealthy ways to take risks. There's a couple of points we have to get to in that I think are interesting. One is that it doesn't say that the only way to be an entrepreneur is through taking a risk and being a man, if that makes sense. And so it just says that you're more likely to do it. The other one is it's looked at correlation versus causation, but the correlation was so, you could say, they were making the argument that they were almost at causation. Again, there's some question marks around that. And then the other point that I think is worth bringing up is like this idea that they were talking about, which I found interesting as well, of this idea of pro-social risk-taking involves things like playing risky sports or, say, engaging in entrepreneurship, versus antisocial risk-taking is the kind of things that would end you up in jail. And so I found that an interesting kind of argument around, that there may be some similar traits to be shared there with regards to risk-taking. I have to say, though, like all research, you can prove your point if you want to. And regarding the point of risk, the jury is still out with regards to whether or not entrepreneurs take more risks. There's some people who mean that, entrepreneurs are risk takers, and there's plenty of other people that mean they're not actually risk takers. They just operate from a different perspective or in a different way with regards to like how they see the world and how they behave. To give you an example of how they don't see it as risk-taking, you could look at some research that comes from someone like Sarasvati out of USA, who says that entrepreneurs don't really take risks, or they make small bets, right? So they don't bet the house. They're not like going all in when they start a business, or at least not in the beginning. They make small bets in the same way that when you play poker, you might lay a few chips down just to see the flop, right, to come to the next hand. And in that sense, she says that's what entrepreneurs do. They sort of make small bets to test out, is this a good idea? Can I get other people involved? Are there early customers who might like the idea? What's the feedback? And how can they make teeny tiny investments and think in the idea of small bets compared to going all in on an untested idea? Now, the going all in would, of course, be a risky behavior, but say laying down a couple of poker chips to get to the next hand isn't really seen as massively risky. It's just seen as part of the process of playing the game, right? And so in that way, entrepreneurship could be seen as risk-taking versus it might not be. I think if I try and summarize or distill my own perspective on it, I'd say that at least in the beginning, there shouldn't be a lot of risk-taking. I think you can test business concepts out relatively easily and relatively cheaply. And I think if you play the game well, you can get to a point where it feels like a lot lower levels of risk to keep going with the business. And of those friends that I have that have played the game well in that way, where they've developed their business concepts over time, got market feedback, I've seen a really high success rate. Often we see this statistic thrown around of like 90% of businesses fail, or 90% of businesses fail within the first year. Yeah, I just have to say from my own personal experiences of watching people play the game in a structured way of trying to start businesses, that doesn't correlate well with what I've seen. I've seen a lot of people go on to be successful over time as long as they're not taking silly risks.
Yeah, makes total sense. Also, there's this classic example that comes to mind. I think it's Richard Branson. negotiating a deal with Boeing to like lend him planes until his company is profitable or something like that, which is like literally no risk at all.
Absolutely.
Like major upside.
Totally. And I think it's also a great example of like rather than cutting the pie up, trying to expand the size of the pie for everyone. And so it's kind of in Boeing's advantage to help them out in that regard. If it was Boeing, I'm not sure who it was, but the plane company is incentivized to help him succeed. And again, back to that research from Sarasvati, she calls that making a patchwork quilt. I don't know if you know the word patchwork quilt or if you have a visual idea of it, which is like all of these different patches sewn together.
Yeah.
And in that sense, you're trying to sew together collaboration efforts or support for your business concept from different people.
But wouldn't that be risk-taking, just not with your own money or stuff in that sense?
Yeah, I guess, I mean, in some ways you are risking other people's money or resources, and that makes sense for an entrepreneur too, right? Like if they can maintain some upside and risk other people's money, that makes sense. At the same time, it's probably not a huge risk for a plane company like Boeing to lend out or lease out an extra 2 planes. I presume in the lease contract it was that they could take the planes back at any time they wanted or something like that. That would allow them to at least limit their losses. So they had upside too, and the potential downside was probably limited. And again, from their size of an organization, I'm sure it was a small bet. I'm sure Boeing wasn't betting the house on Richard Branson either.
Oh, no.
Probably not.
But then you have like sayings like, the higher the risk, the higher the reward. And you have this kind of culture for silly risk-taking that could potentially be influencing the type of risks, especially young people take in that field. Do you have any, I don't know, reflections about that? Like, where does it come from and why has it become this sort of truth?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of unhealthy myths about entrepreneurs, right? And the like bigger the risk, the bigger the reward might be an example of that, or that entrepreneurs are like solo geniuses who do everything alone might be another one. Where they come from, who knows? But at the same time, I think they're starting to get dispelled. And I think some things like lean methodology have been really healthy for helping get people a more grounded perspective about how to move forward. I know I personally get the creeps when I meet someone who's like, oh, I've got a great new idea. I'm like investing my entire life savings in it. I'm going all in. And like, you know, naturally you just want to ask like, oh yeah, what do your customers think? And sometimes they're like, customers, like, what do you mean? Like, I'm going to have customers in like 2 years from now once I've invested all this money in this great new idea. And that makes me feel very nervous and very like icky. Or the other answer you get is like, oh, my mum is my first customer and she loves my idea. And that also makes me feel a little bit uncomfortable.
Your mom's a liar.
Yeah, or I mean, she's not. Like, mum's jobs are to like
I think
love
it's a
you
saying
and to like
in,
support you. Yeah, it is. Like, I think it's a saying your mum's a liar. But I mean, at the same time, she's doing her job. And so you can't blame her for like supporting her child. But at the same time, you really do need to go out and get that feedback from people. And again, I keep referring back to this research from Sarasvati, and that's partly because I think it's such great research. And philosophically, I deeply agree with her perspective on things. And yeah, you know, she just talks about this idea of, now I go off track, I got distracted by thinking about like the philosophical alignment of Sarasvati and myself, which is like an interesting thread in itself. Maybe we can go down that path instead, which was that she had a guy called Herbert Simon, I think, as one of her supervisors, I believe, for her research. And Herbert Simon had this perspective that the future isn't decided. It's still open. And the part of the role of like an entrepreneur is to decide what the future will be by taking catalytic actions to like make things happen. And so she did great research to go and look at like, okay, what do researchers actually do? And that's part of why what do entrepreneurs actually do? And that's part of why I loved her research, is because it's not it's not theoretical in the sense of like just speculating. She went and looked at what people actually did. And she also did a lot of work around how they think, which is partly why it aligns with my like views around like mindset. And
how do you map that?
Yeah, and so she mapped it in a really interesting way. She just gave, first of all, she came up with a very strong definition of what it means to be successful. Off the top of my head, I think it was that they've been entrepreneurs for at least 10 years. They've had at least 2 startups. And I believe that the third criteria and the hardest one was that they'd taken one of those startups to being a listed company. And so that's a really strict criteria in my head. And so she went and looked at these people and said, hey, here's an opportunity. How would you work with this opportunity? And then she observed them for the next couple of hours to see how they worked through the opportunity. And they did things like ring their friends to be like, hey, do you want to get involved? Should we do this together? Who else should I talk to? And she built this entire like model of the way they were doing this. And they had these 5 common traits, or those 5 ways of being that entrepreneurs were generally doing. One of them was limiting losses that we've already talked about. One of them was basically turning lemons into lemonade, and to like flipping negatives or flipping things that aren't going your way to be something positive. Another one was being a pilot in the plane. And that just means like taking charge and being proactive and steering how things are, which makes a lot of sense to me too. Another one was the patchwork quilt we've talked about. Did we get all 5 there, or?
Lemonade.
Yeah, would you like flipping negatives into like into something positive? By the way, I've got a great story about that. It was supposedly a parable, and the parable supposedly goes that there's this guy who has one arm and wants to learn how to fight. So he goes to like a karate dojo, and it's like, can you teach me karate? And the sensei is like, I'll think about it, come back tomorrow. And so he comes back the day after, and sensei teaches him one throw. And he's like, okay. And the sensei's like, just keep practicing this throw. So he keeps practicing. Days go by, and then it's weeks, and then it becomes months. And he's starting to get pretty frustrated. He's like, when do I learn the punches and the kicks and all the other stuff? And so he he's getting antsy and asks the sensei, like, when do I learn this thing? And he says, no, just perfect this one throw. And he keeps going and keeps going. And after a couple of years, the sensei says, okay, I think you're ready to enter like a karate competition. And he's like, what? I know nothing other than this one throw. He's like, don't worry about it. Like, you've got this. And so he sends him into this karate competition, and he wins the entire competition. He like floors everyone by like his use of this one throw. And then so like he wins the competition. He goes to the sensei like, how did you know I was going to win? And the sensei says, well, the only way to defend against this throw is to grab the opposite arm. But of course you don't have that. And so that's the punchline. And so I was like trying to find something for a lecture one day. And so I like put this like in like the one-armed like fighter or something like that. And there's actually an MMA fighter that does fight with what you would call one fully functional arm, and the other one is much more decreased in size, or a very little limb, you'd call it. And he seems to do surprisingly well. Like, it seems like people have a hard time fighting against someone with only one arm. So, maybe there's some truth to it as well, not just a good parable.
Yeah, I guess it's a menacing sight.
Yeah.
Inspirational as hell.
Yeah.
That's for sure.
I'd be scared too.
Yeah, totally, me too.
I got a question about the pilot and the plane thing. That means like taking charge over the situation, as opposed to what? Is my question.
Yeah, so the alternative is, you walk up the ramp and you turn left and join in the pilot's seat, where you control, your altitude, or do fly into the troubled clouds, or do fly around them or under them. Or alternatively, do you go and grab a passenger seat and let someone else steer the direction of where you're going and basically end up wherever they decide you'll end up? So that would be the comparison. In saying that, I think, and if we put that into real context, maybe that means being like a employee, or maybe it means doing something else. But I think there's something important to point out. We often think of entrepreneurship as being starting your own companies. But there's also something called entrepreneurship, which is about starting or creating value within an organization. And I think that's entirely true, that you're capable of being entrepreneurial inside of existing organizations. And so entrepreneurship to me isn't limited to the act of starting a business. While that's often an outcome, it's more about the way of behaving and the way of seeing the world and seeing opportunities, acting on those opportunities, creating values, and that there is an element of risk in there too.
Yeah, that would be... Then you'd have to be a place where those kind of risks are tolerated, allowed, encouraged even. And how do you go forward with something like that? How do you, show the value of risk-taking before risk-taking?
Yeah. I mean, if I interpret your question about like how do you be an entrepreneur inside an organization, what we often see is that no one gives them permission and no one asks them to do it necessarily. It's often that they get frustrated with the status quo, or they believe strongly that the status quo should be different, and they therefore just start stitching together that patchwork quilt of collaborators. They build a small gang of people to help them get this thing done or to get this project underway, and they just basically do it often without necessarily getting that permission either, until they get what you might call corporate buy-in, or buy-in from others in the organization who see the momentum they're generating and the results they're generating, and then they sort of build legitimacy along the way through doing that. What inspires these people to be like, what's word for it, so unbounded, in the sense that they just decide to do something different from everyone else? Who knows? But it is kind of fascinating in itself that some people still refuse to be constrained by those organizational boundaries and see opportunities in places that other people were content to sit back and be the passengers in the plane. And instead they make the choice to be like, nope, I can make a difference. And at the risk of sounding like naive or like airy-fairy, I also strongly believe that too, that all of us can make a difference. Maybe not all of us are going to make a giant difference, but I think all of us can make at least a small difference. And I think it's more fun to behave as though you can make a difference as well. If you think about like, how do you want to turn up in the world? Do you want to turn up in a way that you can have an impact and maybe try and do something positive? Or do you want to turn up in a world where you believe it's impossible? There's a great guy called Albert Bandura who came up with this idea of self-efficacy. And self-efficacy looks at like, again, almost like a similar question of my research. What's the difference between those who are effective and get things done versus those who aren't? And so people who are effective were high in self-efficacy. And basically he said that the key difference was their belief in their capacity to do something, or their belief in their capacity to achieve that which they set out to achieve. And what's fascinating about that, I think, is that, he framed it up really nicely in saying that believing you can do something doesn't guarantee success, but believing you can't do anything guarantees failure, because you never even bother trying.
Yeah.
And so back to my point, I think it's far more fun to turn up in the world and pretend you can make a difference, and maybe you get around to making a difference. Maybe it's small, maybe it's big, but you'll never know without at least giving it a shot. And in that sense, I think entrepreneurs have a lot of that inside them, that they have this deep belief or a sense of identity about themselves, where they see themselves as being capable of achieving the outcomes they want. Or at least, again, there's another interesting piece of research or a theoretical model. It says if we want to predict what people's behaviors are, let's look at their intentions. And you go, okay, well, great, what's an intention though? And they say, okay, well, an intention's made up of two things. One is your desire to do it, and two is your belief about whether or not you can do it. And so if you, and by the way, they're not equal in the importance with regards to intentions.
Okay.
And so the difference is, right, desirability and belief in your ability to do it. While it's great if you have both, you really actually only need one, which is desirability. If desirability is high enough that like it becomes like a life or death thing for you, and you're like, I have to do this, and I have no idea. So I don't believe in my capacity to do it. Like, I have no idea how I'll do it, but man, I really have to get it done. Then actually that's enough to overcome that lack of belief in yourself. And that's a really fascinating idea to me too, where like often do we burn enough for the thing we're trying to get done? And I think most of the time we kind of don't. If we're like really deeply honest with ourselves, I think a lot of the time we kind of kid ourselves. We're like, and the joke, by the way, from something else is like, oh, I'd do anything to lose weight except like eat healthy and exercise, right? And it's kind of the same in entrepreneurship, where it's like, oh, I'd do anything to make this business a success, except for take that like emotionally painful step and awkward way of being and like trying out these new things that feel unsafe to me. I'd do anything but that. And it's like, well, those are the things you actually need to do in order to bring about the outcomes you want, right? Because if we think about like that original definition of mindset about like generating outcomes, your current process isn't working. Otherwise, you'd have the outcome. And so you need to be doing something different. But there's something that emotionally is like standing in the way between you taking that step. And in some ways, there's another great like motivational theory that looks at like, again, what's behind people taking action versus not. And the original analogy I heard about is like an accelerator and a brake. And it comes from a book written by, if I'm about to mispronounce her name, but I think it's Nagasaki. And I forget the exact topic of the book, but the rough topic is, I believe, about female orgasm. And she talks about the fact that, there's this motivational state of accelerator and brake. And I went and looked at the theory that she was using for that book, and actually it applies to a whole different bunch of fields, and she's taken it from the other fields and applied it to sexology, which is interesting in itself. But anyway, back to the analogy. The accelerator obviously makes you go forward, like as in that's the desire about what you want, but there's also this brake, right? And that brake about what stands in the way for entrepreneurs is, I think, somewhat under-researched and not necessarily very well understood. And I think a lot of that connects, my own speculation around that relates to things around like emotional pain. It feels emotionally painful to do things that are, say, new or unknown, or maybe just feel awkward for you. And then the other one would be fears, that we have a lot of fears that stand in the way. And so we fear actually maybe being successful, or we fear taking the next step, or we fear being different. And then the other one might be around like a sense of identity, right? Like that we behaving in a way that would lead to success would be inconsistent with how we view ourselves. And so therefore we don't take the step. There's a completely separate theory that says that explains pretty much everyone's behavior, is that we're trying to be consistent with our sense of identity. Like, who are we as human beings? How do we see ourselves? What's that like mental picture we hold in our own heads of who I am? And an action would be inconsistent with that, then we don't take that action. So again, if we use like exercise as an example, if we see ourselves as like someone who's like fit and healthy and like really sporty, when we get to the lift versus the stairs option, we'll take the stairs because that's what sporty people do. Versus if we don't have that mental image of ourselves, it might be more tempting to take the lift. And so the same is true for entrepreneurship too, right? If we see ourselves as like the kind of person who goes out and talks to people, unknown people, and makes sales and like hustles, if we see ourselves in that way, then we're likely to do it. Whereas if we see ourselves not in that way, or we have some like negative relationship to people who say go out and hustle and make sales, if we're like, ugh, those people are like snake oil salesmen, or those people are kind of slippery, I don't like them, and we hold a negative image of what it would be to be that way, then of course we'll feel some kind of like a internal resistance or emotional resistance to being that way. And so we won't take the actions, even though it's in our own best interest to be that way. So yeah, then it becomes an interesting question of how do we get people to update their sense of identity or mental picture to being something that's more healthy or constructive for them personally.
This might be out of your field, but do you have any like thoughts or reflections around when those kind of mental images take place or take a hold of you in regards of age?
I don't have a concrete answer to that, but again, I believe that we can change our image or our identity or our mental picture at any point in our life.
Yeah.
Obviously, the longer you've been repeating a pattern, the more ingrained that picture of yourself becomes. But there's always stories about people who make snap changes in their lives and produce something that's different. So in that sense, I think we can always update our mental image. And so my message around that would be, does it matter when it's formed if you can always reform it? And I strongly believe it's never too late. And I think science would back me up on this too, right? With regards to neuroplasticity, that the more you practice an action, the more ingrained it becomes. And I think that's true of identity too. The more you practice the action, the more it becomes part of who you are. So, I mean, is it ever too late to hit the gym? I think I heard a podcast actually with a guy who was a great example, where he started lifting weights at 73, I believe it was. And all his friends told him, like, what a waste of time, you're 73, why are you lifting weights? And I think at 93, he became a world champion in his class.
Wow.
And everyone's like, wow, that's amazing, 93, a world champion. And he's like, no, what's amazing is I've had a 20-year weightlifting career after everyone told me it was too late. And by most people's standards, a 20-year career in anything is a long career. And so he had a really long career in weightlifting, and he started at 73. And so I always find that story inspirational about, like, look, it's never too late to get something started.
In regards to entrepreneurship, I also have this, let's call it a theory, regarding, like, one thing is the identity part of things, but also, at least I could recognize in myself the tendency to project an image into the future of like a future success, but then actually taking actions towards it would be risking the picture itself, if that makes sense. So like by actually going for it, you are risking the potential of having that comforting future dream like bursting into flames, basically.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I've heard mixed things on this. I'm not sure how much I've heard about from a like scientific research perspective, but I've definitely heard different perspectives around being careful about visualizing the good things that have happened or the results that have happened, because then you lose motivation to take the steps to do it. Versus I've heard other people, of course, talking about like visualize to get success. Again, I don't know what the like research says on this, but it is an interesting point to note that if you get that mental reward from doing the positive activity in your head, you might be less motivated to go out there and do the hard work to generate the real outcome in itself.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
It does. And it's a really interesting like crash of worlds, I guess, because there's this mental training part of it, or like what the NLP people does, like the performance coaches, where you like visualize the goals. But Yeah, and also like the spiritual kind of communities where like the law of attraction and stuff
Mm.
like that, where like you're supposed to
Mm.
visualize, feel,
Mm.
do everything.
Mm.
So I don't know, because in like the sports psychology stuff, they like visualize movements as a part of their sport, and that really does make sense. Like visualizing, like how your body would move, and like feeling your heart rate go up before a speech or something like that, and being prepared.
Mm.
But goal accomplishment in itself seems it isn't that obvious to me that it makes sense to visualize.
Mm. Mm.
Are you like speaking about visualizing the feeling of achieving the goal, or just visualizing the goal in itself? If that makes sense.
Let's just say I talked to a coach once that suggested visualize achieving your goal, but then put it at a distance
Mm.
as not to feel too satisfied already.
Mm.
It's like,
Maybe a way to like relate that into what we've been talking about already is that desirability aspect, right? So if you maybe integrate it as your identity, then that's helpful, but still maintain it as a desirable state to get to, so that you don't decrease the desirability that forms part of the intention, right? We had those two factors, desirability and belief, in order to create intention. So if you decrease desirability, and desirability is like, I want the thing in the future, like I haven't got satisfaction of having had it yet, then it makes sense to like desire, like to set up the identity picture of someone who got the thing, but not decrease desirability to get it. It sounds like a bit of a contradiction, but I don't know what that would look like in practice.
yeah, I don't know. It's kind of not though. It's like you try to form your identity into one that would be able to achieve your goal that you
Yep.
set out to achieve. Or
I mean, if we put back into the context of mindsets, right? If we like jump back on track around like some work that's come from Carol Dweck around growth mindsets, it's been very well cited. I would make an argument that it's not necessarily about mindsets; it's more about beliefs. That might be a slightly controversial perspective and maybe a bit academic, but anyway. Her work looks at this idea of like, trying to get away from measuring ourselves in terms of success, but instead looking at actions towards the outcomes we want. So like, we should take actions, and we don't get the outcomes we want, be like, okay, well, I tried, I practiced, I learned from it, instead of either I achieved the outcome and therefore I'm a good person, or I didn't achieve the outcome and therefore I now dislike myself more. I think I'm a bad person. Which, of course, is not true. It's just that you tried something and it didn't work. And so she talks about people who have this fixed mindset of either you achieve or you don't achieve as being more, I think she'd describe it as like fragile, or like open to feeling greater pain when they don't get the outcome they wanted, versus people with a growth mindset have more of a, oh, well, I tried and now I learned, and I'm now richer for the experience, and I'll try the next thing. Again, back to this idea of small bets. When you say I tried, it shouldn't be I tried and bet the entire house. It's like I tried a little thing that stretched myself, or I made a small bet, and then that worked, or it didn't. And if it didn't, at least I learned.
yeah, betting the house takes a whole nother level when it's your self-esteem on the line.
Yeah, totally.
Not
totally.
just your money.
Would you like to tell us more about your experience as a entrepreneurship teacher?
Sure. Which direction should we go with that, or where would we like to jump in?
Yeah.
How frustrating is it?
It is frustrating, if I'm honest, but it might be frustrating for a surprising reason, and that frustration relates to, I think I have a really high belief in my students, and I think really highly of them, and they don't always live up to their own potential, right? And that's their choice, and there's a freedom of choice in not living up to that. And who am I to say what they should and shouldn't be doing? But at the same time, it's like frustrating to sit on the sidelines as a coach and to see absolutely wonderful people who could do amazing things basically limit themselves and hold themselves back and not necessarily achieve that full potential that they could live up to. And so that's where the frustration lies for me, around like trying to get people to generate the outcomes they want because they want them, not because I told them they should or anything like that. It's not about like trying to trick people into doing things or forcing people to do things. I think it's manipulative and not something I want to be involved in. But it's more about when you see people who I think deeply do want to generate the results, but kind of don't. Or maybe even sometimes people who you see as deeply talented, but they lack that desire or they lack that deep belief and the passion to achieve something amazing, or they don't believe they can have a positive impact on the world, so therefore they don't even bother trying. And I think that's, to me, that's the most frustrating thing. I feel like it sounds a little like cliche and naive, but it's also genuinely the truth. I do. And that's one of the reasons why I did originally get involved in education. I feel like for me, there wasn't a lot of role models out there who expressed a deep belief in me. There were some, but not a lot. And so I think I got a lot of negative feedback when I was younger about my potential to do things, or I got a lot of like, no, you can't kind of feedback. And by the time and that left me with a deep frustration because a deep belief in me said, yes, I can. And I think having gone on to do a lot of interesting things, I think for a certain extent I proved that to be true. And my contribution I'd like to make is to try and instill a more positive belief system in others. I think expanding on this, or at least an idea that's been helpful for me, is like expanding on this idea between mindset versus routines versus, say, addiction. And so mindsets is about trying to get an outcome, and you're a little bit indifferent about what tactic you use to get there, and you're willing to try different tactics. Versus a routine is you do the same tactic time and time again, and sometimes you get the result you want, or at least there probably was a positive feedback loop in the beginning, and so you just keep doing it as a routine. And sometimes that can limit you too. And then the third one would be if we think about addiction as being something that gave you a very positive feedback in the beginning, but over time becomes more and more destructive for you. But you get stuck in the routine of doing the same thing time and time again, even to the point where it's potentially, or not potentially, it is no longer serving you, but you can't break out of that routine. And that's what, it's partly what addiction looks like. And yeah, to me, I think it's interesting to consider those three options about where are you at. Are you stuck in a routine and you're just doing something because that's what you've always done? Or is it actually generating the outcome you want? And often I find that people are in their day-to-day lives stuck in routines, and they're just doing it, and they're doing it unconsciously. And so when we take the time to like stand back and reflect on those routines, we're like, is this serving you? Is it helping you? Or do you want to try on a different routine? Do you want to try a different tactic and see if that serves you better? And often that new tactic can feel scary because it's new. Maybe you doubt your capacity to do it. Maybe it's inconsistent with your identity, so you don't. But ultimately, if we want to get different outcomes to the ones we currently have, we're probably going to have to do something different.
Yeah, that's a deep rabbit hole we could go down. I'm game.
I'm game too.
So like, I find like secondary goals really fascinating. Because like, this is
Could you just quickly define what you mean by secondary goals?
Secondary goals, it might be the wrong term, but again, this is an NLP concept, but like the strategies you have are perfect to achieve the outcomes you are getting. And often, no matter which outcomes you have, you will meet some kind of need in one form or another. Maybe it's not the need you think you have or the need you are trying to meet, but you will often meet some kind of what I call secondary goals. And to make an example, this would be like you want to get in shape, but you can't like seem to figure out your diets. You always like eat some Twinkies in the in the middle of the night or whatever. And probably there's a need for comfort or whatever, right? And you satisfy the need for comfort or safety or whatever it may be. Or like a thing I hear quite often with like tobacco. It's like, this is my friend, or it keeps me warm, or like it comforts me, right? So even though you're trying to get healthy, in the moment you will quickly try to satisfy the need for comfort.
Totally makes sense. Yeah, I think it resonates closely with how I see things too. I like that description around the tactics you have are the perfect thing for the results you're getting.
Yeah.
That speaks to me a lot, right? And with regards to those secondary goals, yeah, I think sometimes they can be really dark too. Nelson Mandela had this idea that our greatest fear is that inside of us is, this great potential to be a really powerful human being and have a big impact. And I think there's a lot of truth to that, right? And I think that's why a lot of us fear playing on a bigger scale than we're currently playing on, because we're afraid of reaching towards that true greatness. And so in that sense, our tactics are perfect for the outcomes we're currently getting, because there's a secondary goal of not playing too big, because we're actually afraid of living up to our full potential.
How do you rationalize that kind of fear?
Could you elaborate on your question? Like how to...
Yeah, I think because when I'm thinking about it, it seems kind of backwards to limit yourself in that way. I don't know what I'm trying to get at is, what is the risk you're taking by living up to your potential?
It's a really deep question, and I think I have heard some thoughts on it from some bigger thinkers, and from what I can remember, they're framing it around like the higher you fly, the higher you can fall, and so therefore living up to that full potential gives you the space to fall from that full potential, and so therefore it feels safer to be the person you are now than to potentially be something more than you currently are. And I think we can see that as well around like the idea or the concept of what they call like homeostasis, which is our current state feels the safest for us. Emotionally, it feels the safest for us. And so for some people who are living in really unhealthy homeostasis states, changing to a technically healthier state feels worse, which seems totally counterintuitive. I have a small example for myself, which would be one of my homeostasis would be one of being in like a semi-stressed state of trying to make a lot of things happen and packing my calendar. So as soon as I have like empty space in my calendar, I have an unhealthy habit of filling it up to the point that I get like busy and like a little bit stressed again. And so there's no way that stress is healthy for me. Yet being out of that stress state feels more, for lack of better words, feels more stressful, or feels like worse than being in the healthier place of having more slack in the system and more space. And so we can get stuck in these unhealthy things pretty easy. And I think if we're honest with ourselves, I think probably all of us have a little bit of that, and it gets a little bit like awkward to start like taking an honest look in the mirror and be like, oh my gosh, there's a lot of truth to that.
Like the most obvious example is when you're really mad or even sad for that matter. And you're like, you don't want to cheer up at all.
No.
No.
It's like that's at the bottom of the
Yeah.
list. You want to be like freaking angry.
Yeah,
right?
what's the saying? It's like if you're angry for more than 10 seconds, then you like want to be angry.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
it's serving you somehow, where it's like, oh, I'm rightfully angry, and so I'm gonna just like
But-
hang on to this anger and like
Sure.
demonstrate how right I am to be
Yeah.
angry.
I'm reading a book, interestingly enough, about that speaks about that, and it says something about the way you gain something out of those negative emotions, and like say during childhood you got what you wanted out of
Mm,
tantrums and
Mm,
being
mm.
angry, and of course your brain's gonna get wired, in a sense, get wired to when you're angry and you react in an angry manner or express your anger, you'll probably get what you want. And I used this example the other day, where if I'm angry at him, say, and I express my anger, or just, you can like sense it, you can see it, and you can feel the anger, he'll probably notice and ask me what's wrong, and I'll get what I want, because then I get to rant. But the irony is, if you just take out the anger and just express your emotion the second they, I don't know, emerge, you'll spare yourself so much negativity and just
not only
lose-
that, but
yeah.
you'll increase your chances of actually getting what you want.
Yeah.
Instead of like, say, having to be angry at Andreas in the hope that he'll give you the attention you need, for example,
Yeah.
it would probably work a lot better to be like, hey, Andreas, I really like some attention right now. If that's the thing you want, I'm just like, I have no idea if that was a good example.
Yeah,
But
no.
like, if that was it, just like simply stating him like, could I please, like, or this is what I have like a desire for right now, it would probably work much better than like being angry. And so it's this weird, like, again, this weird counterintuitive thing where our routines have served us up until this point.
Mm.
But if we want more, if we want to go beyond that and expand like our capacity to do interesting things, we need to try on new routines.
Mm.
And I think who's it, Mark Manson has a good way of describing this, where he talks about this idea of trying on clothes. We try on new clothes all the time, and sometimes they fit great and we keep them, and other times they don't fit and we take them off and we return them. The same is true with like tactics or routines or ways of being, or like a sense of identity. Try it on for size. Does it fit? Do you like it? Do you get the outcomes you want? If so, great, keep it. If not, go back to the thing you've done forever, how many years you've been doing it. There's nothing to say you can go back to what you were originally doing.
Yeah.
Like, it's entirely possible.
What's fascinating, at least for me, is in some sense it's harder to like take that step and actually talk about it instead of just doing what you're used to do and just being angry. And I guess that goes back to routines and the way we've always done thing.
Totally. It also requires a higher level of consciousness than what you've had previously,
Yeah.
or what might necessarily be available to you in the moment. Like if you are genuinely feeling frustrated, it can be an emotional, it can be like a challenge to like stand back and be like, so what's this all about? Because you're all like flustered and pent up or like angry or whatever it happens to be in the moment, and being able to put a gap in there between trigger and emotion is really this idea of consciousness.
Mm.
And, you know, according to Viktor Frankl, that's where we gain our sense of power over ourselves and our original power that no one else can take away from us,
Mm.
which I think is a lot of truth to that.
Yeah. Yeah, in some sense, like separating the reaction from yourself, I guess. I don't know. Yeah.
So we're doing research regarding the entrepreneurial ecosystem here in Fredrikstad. So we would really like your take on the barriers for entrepreneurs, and especially young entrepreneurs. And also, if you have any reflections about any specific barriers here, that would be really interesting.
Sure, I think maybe if we look at the big picture, like I think by a big picture, I mean Norway. I think there's some cultural aspects that traditionally haven't necessarily favored a lot of traditional entrepreneurship around, what should we say, cultural aspects around the fact that you don't want to stand out and be different. There's a really high need for conformity here, and that's backed up by research as well, saying there's really strong social norms. I forget the exact placing of where Norway is, but I believe it's in the top 10 of other countries. And when you look at who those other countries are, it's kind of surprising that Norway ends up in there as well. And so Norway's
What
got
kind of ranking is this?
for social norms.
Oh, yeah.
And so, Norway ranks really highly within those social norms. And so people haven't wanted to be different. And in a sense, entrepreneurship is really about being different. It's about not doing what's being done before and trying to create something different. And so in collective societies, things work really well in many regards. Socially, there's a lot of social cohesion, but the downside of that is like a need to blend in with the rest of society and not stand out. So I think that's a challenge, but I think it's been changing, and at least within the time I've been here, it seems like the entrepreneurship ecosystem, both in Norway and Fredrikstad, has become a lot more active. There's a lot more going on within that sense. I hear a lot of people talking about limits around getting access to financing and VCs and angel financing and that kind of thing. But I don't know too much about that, but I would hazard to say that it seems like it's changing, both here in Fredrikstad and nationally, probably a little bit quicker nationally than Fredrikstad, but I think it's changing. I know we've all heard about like Fortress Fund here locally as being something that's starting up. Whether or not that will directly impact the ecosystem, we don't know, but it's an example of money flowing in the direction of, say, innovation and entrepreneurship. It's probably going to be more focused on more advanced companies than, say, really initial startups. And then if we examine it from a different perspective, which is what do we need to be entrepreneurs in today's world with regards to technical skills, and some of them might be relating to science, some of them might be relating to coding, that kind of stuff. There isn't as much of a strong ecosystem around those strong technical fields here in Fredrikstad as there could be, so maybe there's an opportunity to strengthen some of them. I feel like, again, the local ecosystem of small companies has been growing, but it doesn't mean that we've maxed out our capacity on that one either. So there's a lot of room to grow there. You could probably take a look at one of the great predictors of whether or not someone will be an entrepreneur was their parent an entrepreneur. And so as we get more and more entrepreneurs or children growing up in homes where parents are entrepreneurs, we could reasonably expect that over time we'll get more entrepreneurs along the way. I think the social netting we have in Norway is like a double-edged sword. I mean, that's one of the safest places in the world to basically fail at being an entrepreneur, because at worst case scenario you can get social help, but at the same time that may remove some of the push into being an entrepreneur that might exist in other places where you might have fewer options about like how you could make a decent living. I also think there's if we look at the like economic ecosystems here, or the economic systems here, I think they tend to favor larger companies as well. There's a lot of worker protections that exist, and I don't think they should necessarily be removed, but for a small company to stay up to date on all of the rules and regulations around hiring employees, it takes a lot of time and energy and effort and resources away from, say, potentially the main goal of the company. And so while I think protection for workers is an important thing, it comes with a downside, which is that small companies trying to hire people might struggle to stay on the right side of all of the compliance issues connected to that too.
Mm.
Don't get me wrong, I'm not saying small companies don't take care of their employees, but I'm saying like to stay up to date on the rules and regulations is a challenge.
Yeah. You
Yeah.
don't have like lawyers and you don't have the resources to necessarily keep up either.
If I like highlight some things I think are going well locally, very much for locally, I think Ungt Entreprenørskap is doing a great job. I really admire the work they do. I think there's good people working in that locally, and this is not my opinion, but I guess I should be cautious on mentioning it. But I've heard through a grapevine that that's not true in all of Norway. That there's some places in which Ungt Entreprenørskap is not as active as they could be. And my reason for pointing that out is that we should just really celebrate how good the people here are. It's not about casting light on people in other areas. It's more about like, hey, let's celebrate the people we've got here who are doing a good job. Because I genuinely think they do work hard at trying to train up young people and help them go through a process of seeing themselves as being more entrepreneurial. And then I think the other question that maybe this is an uncomfortable question for you guys to ask, but it might be, do we necessarily want more people to be entrepreneurs, given that there's some dark sides to entrepreneurship too? One, there's a lot less, what would you call it, work security or security or, financial security. There's a lot of stress. The stress seems to correlate with mental health issues as well. I say correlate because some of those issues might exist before people become entrepreneurs, or they might be caused by it, but we don't know. They just correlate. And yeah, it tends to be associated with like longer work hours as well. I think The Economist says it well, where it says it's about as comfortable as chewing on glass for breakfast every single day. And it paints a great mental image of like, being an entrepreneur isn't always comfortable. And so the question is, do we want to actually encourage our young people to do it? If they've got great job security and they can earn good money and they can have a comfortable lifestyle, is that such a bad thing? I mean, that's a real privilege we have in our society, and I don't necessarily have a opinion one way or another, but I think it's worth asking the question.
I believe social media has a huge role to play in it, with like glamorizing the entrepreneurial lifestyle where you get to be your own boss and earn money without doing anything. That's like
in that sense, I really dislike that kind of side of it. In some ways, I think entrepreneurship has become sexy, for lack of better terms, or it's become cool. And that grates me a little bit, because I think entrepreneurship to me used to be more of a hard grind, or it was kind of like, it wasn't cool.
Yeah.
And so if you were doing it, a little bit. And so if you were doing it, there had to be a really strong reason for doing it. Now I feel like maybe there might be some people who are doing it because it seems like the cool option.
I feel like in Norway especially as well, we don't necessarily speak about the downsides or the like attempts that didn't necessarily
go well.
And then you just see like hear about the success stories and how everything went smoothly and how everything's great, and we have this way of glamorizing the whole path in a way, and we don't speak about the like hardships and what we've learned when things didn't go well.
Totally. Maybe pulling on the thread from a different angle is also looking at that double-edged sword of the support that, say, Innovation Norway gives, or the government gives for entrepreneurs starting out and testing their ideas. It seems like it becomes a huge distraction for many of them as well, where they become focused on getting the next round of financing as opposed to getting the company launched and getting customers and making an impact earlier on.
We've pretty much confirmed that in a lot of our research, at least locally, where we have the opportunity to apply for funds from the municipality, where a lot of entrepreneurs have told us that either it took away too much time, not only the application process, which is truly a process in itself, but also keeping up with the demands
the
that the
compliance
funds.
of it. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So a lot of people are telling us that they don't even bother.
Yeah, I think I would tell people about really thinking twice about applying for government funds.
So we've established that there's not only upsides to entrepreneurship. There's a lot of eating glass, so to speak, mental health issues. If I'm not mistaken, the suicide rates are pretty dramatic. Looking at entrepreneurs,
I would believe it. I don't know. I haven't seen it, but that kind of makes sense to me. Which I think is a really sad thing too. If people are committing suicide over it, for multiple reasons, but one in particular is that to me tells me there's like a lot of shame attached to failure, and I've seen that from people who are very close to me and haven't succeeded in the way they would have liked to have, that there's huge amounts of shame attached to it that they carried for years and years and years. And while that's not my story to tell, I think it's a shame to hear that people get to the point where they think the best way is to no longer be here. Because I really think that's true. I really think that removing yourself from the world is the answer. So yeah, please, if you've tried something and it didn't work, just see that as like an attempt. Don't see it as like a shame-filled experience of which you've demonstrated that you're inferior as a human being, because that's not true. I think it's worth celebrating attempts. Everyone gets to make mistakes. There's no shoulds out there that exist, like in regards to it's fine to try things and it's fine that they don't go as planned.
Should be a learning experience
Yeah, and the obvious way out of that is, look, no one's perfect. No one's perfect. And so if that's true, then all of us get to make a mistake sooner or later. And in saying that, there has to be a whole range of mistakes. Some are bigger than others. And it doesn't mean you then get off free with regards to that. You get to go and make all the mistakes you want and be like, oh, whoopsie, I made some mistakes. It's still about trying to turn up and do your best and acting in a responsible way. And if it doesn't turn out how you thought it would, then you have to own that, like live with it. But I don't think shame is a helpful place to stand in. A little bit back to our discussion around like, sometimes you get angry, but you actually want something else. That sense of anger wasn't helpful in that entire package. In fact, it may have even stood in the way. And I think shame is a similar thing. Standing in shame and being shameful for what are reasonable behaviors or behaviors that were taken in your best attempt to do something constructive is, that's not worthy of being in shame. It's like, give yourself a little bit more space to try things out. And that also goes for society as well, right? Like, we need to give people the space to try things and make mistakes and not shame them for it. Maybe we can leave people on a more positive note, which would be around that, like, look, if we remove the shame, we all have the capacity to make a difference. And we can all think of someone who's made a difference in our life, right? And so if we turn up every single day trying to be like, hey, how do I have like a small impact on someone else around me? Or how do I have a small positive impact for my own life? Or like, how do I take one step closer to something that feels desirable and achievable for me? Then over the long run, I think we can all contribute in our own little way to creating a better place to live. And to me, that's like the definition of like a society I'd want to live in, where we can all do our best. And as humans, we won't always live up to that, and that's okay. But like, it doesn't.
That requires like tolerance as well from people around you, and maybe not tolerance, but the acceptance, maybe.
Absolutely. And I think we underestimate how much those who matter to us will accept from us as well. And we often are our own harshest critic in that regard.
I just want to share this quote that I love. I think it's Steve Jobs, probably like misquoted and paraphrased, but he said something along the lines of, when you figure out that you can poke the world and something will stick out on the other end, you'll never be the same. And I think that's such a powerful thing, because that speaks to how you can like learn the mindset that you can be a player and not just a pawn on the chessboard, but you can actually make something happen. And when you realize it, like, you'll never be the same.
Pilot in the plane.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, I guess maybe my final thought would be that one that comes from Herbert Simon, which is that the future hasn't been decided. And if you know the butterfly effect about like small actions or small changes in variables can have giant outcomes later on due to the complexity of the world we live in, then you'll never underestimate small actions again, and therefore you'll always be trying to take at least the small actions to shift you in the right direction.
I like it.
That's a great way to end it.
Nice, thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.